Israeli military is looking at this as as the first step towards de-escalation. Their relationship with the West becomes very important. We are already seeing a lot of concern in the West, especially the Hamas bit is a long-term challenge. And we have also heard Netanyahu telling Mossad and others that you'll have to hunt down Hamas leadership wherever they are. China is struggling on multiple fronts. While they proclaim global leadership, that these 2+2 mechanisms, these regular consultations, allow for those kinds of possibilities to remain at the center stage of our engagement. I know we are ending, but I just wanted to add a bit on UK, which is very interesting.
Hello and welcome to the Ideas Factory. I'm Naghma. Joining me is Professor Pant. A lot has happened in the world in these weeks. There has been an India, Australia, US 2+2. Of course, the Gaza conflict is on, but it is now witnessing a much needed breather in the form of those 4 days of ceasefire. The humanitarian aid is able to reach the people. So that, of course, is there. And President Joe Biden and Xi Jinping have had a meeting almost after a year amidst all the tension that's going around the world, and the China-US relationship also that has seen many ups and downs. So we'll be discussing and looking at all of that on this episode of the Ideas Factory. Harsh, to begin with, it's a very volatile situation right now in the Gaza Strip, which has been continuing. Israel and Hamas, the war continues, but of course now there is a breather, the 4-day ceasefire that we are now seeing. What it has done is the aid is reaching people, and it was much needed. The exchange of people is taking place. But if you look at it in the bigger context of the problem there, what does it really achieve? And will this window really give time for the world powers to rethink the strategy in this area? Could we see a strategic shift there?
Naghma, it's been a very difficult situation, almost nightmarish for the people of Gaza over the last few weeks. And of course, the challenges there continue to come up in different guises. But this has been certainly, as you put it, a breather in that sense that some kind of humanitarian intervention was needed, and this perhaps allows for the possibility of aid reaching to the right place, and of course, then creating a conducive climate for further de-escalation. However, I don't think Israeli military is looking at this as the first step towards de-escalation, because from there, what we are hearing from IDF is that this is they are looking at the next stage of their activities, which is going to target south of Gaza, and I think that is going to be very, very challenging, because from their perspective, they believe that most of the Hamas fighters and leadership is there, and they would like to target them. But because you also have the population of Gaza now restricted to a very, very small geographic territory, that is also going to make it extremely challenging. And from Israeli perspective, the most difficult issue would be whether they will continue to receive the support from the West, and in particular the US, as they go into the next stage of this military operation. Because from their perspective, this is just a pause where they are allowing certain kinds of humanitarian aid to come in, and humanitarian agencies to do their bit. But they do look at this as a pause, which then takes them into the next stage. And for them, I think largely they view their end game as decapitating Hamas. Now, how they are able to achieve that, and whether that's a reasonable end game, all those questions remain valid. But I think from their perspective, this is something that they continue to look at as a possibility. Then, therefore, their relationship with the West becomes very important. We are already seeing a lot of concern in the West, even in the US, about what is happening in the Middle East, and how this pans out between, I think, Washington and Tel Aviv. That will determine the future trajectory of this conflict. But of course, the suffering is huge. The crisis has grown to a magnitude where perhaps it could not be ignored. And I think this exchange of hostages and prisoners that is happening at the moment perhaps also allows for the possibility that there might be an attempt to take this truce, to extend this truce. And we have heard from Egyptians and Qataris that this might be a possibility. But I don't see, from Israeli point of view, any let up in their activities, because they do view this as a very significant military operation. And from the very beginning, they had been saying that they want to bring or decapitate Hamas to a level where another of this guy's October 7th kind of an attack would not happen. So if that is the end game, then this is just a pause in between to allow for certain kinds of things to happen, but not in any way a de-escalation in the military operation side.
Absolutely. As you said, probably it gives a window, it gives a time to rethink. But the decapitating of Hamas, it looks like a very long term plan. It cannot be really achieved in a short term. And we also told that there have been protests and people's movements in Israel also protesting against Netanyahu. And there's a lot of domestic pressure. He has this pressure for the release of the hostages as well as finishing of Hamas, as he's been proclaiming. So now, in that case, it's a situation which is very fluid. And of course, we do not see peace returning in the area. Also, the way Europe and US have been there with Israel, this could also escalate into another world crisis that it is already is right now.
Yes, I think it is already a crisis of a kind that few had anticipated. Just before October 7th. But certainly, when you look at the pressure on Netanyahu domestically, when you see the suggestion that eventually he has to go, therefore it is also now an attempt from his side to shore up his credibility. And even though there is enormous pressure on him to go, I think he also wants to showcase that there is enough space available for him to demonstrate that he remains a leader of some significance, that he can still deliver on some commitments. And I think the pressure, first and foremost, to get the hostages out, and then to see that Hamas is decapitated to a point where it cannot bounce back. Those are, as you point out, especially the Hamas bit is a long-term challenge. And we have also heard Netanyahu telling Mossad and others that you'll have to hunt down Hamas leadership wherever they are. So it's of course, I think it's going to be a very long-drawn battle between Hamas and Israel. But the pressure on the region, the pressure on the Palestinians is making it an immediate challenge as well. And I think that contradiction cannot be resolved without someone giving in. So at this point, it's not clear who gives in. And I think the pressure in the Western societies, in European countries, also we have seen a lot of protests against this crisis. So I think the politicians in Western countries are also aware of the costs that this crisis is imposing on them domestically. And I think ultimately that will be the arbiter of how far they would like to go in supporting Israel. But at the moment, certainly with this pause, there is an attempt, as you said, there is an opportunity to reassess where this crisis is going and how this might unfold over the next few weeks.
Of course. And while this is on, President Joe Biden and Xi Jinping also had a meeting. And this meeting on the sidelines of APEC in San Francisco was something that was really the world looked forward to. Now, there has been a lot of tension that's been going on between China and the United States. And now the two leaders meeting while the Gaza crisis is on. Of course, Ukraine-Russia crisis is there, though right now the world is looking the other side because of the Gaza crisis. Now, this is the first time they met in about a year. What did it really achieve in terms, what was at stake with China and the United States that the two leaders met? Because hours after the meeting, Biden again went on to call him a dictator. So this meeting, it took place, great, but what did it really achieve, considering the differences between US and China are huge on many fronts, whether it's China's the sovereignty issues or political or economic problems?
Well, indeed, these are structural differences, fundamental differences, and I don't think there is a possibility of these structural differences getting resolved anytime soon, just because the two leaders happen to meet somewhere. But I think on both sides there were enough reasons to meet. For Biden, I think he would not want another crisis on his hands, as he's dealing with the Middle East, he's dealing with Ukraine. There are multiple challenges, and he goes into the election mode for his re-election. So I don't think there is any bandwidth available to manage another crisis if that crisis escalates, say for example, in Taiwan Straits or in South China Sea. So I think he clearly wants, and Washington certainly want a relationship with China that is workable. That is where, at least at the military to military level, there are interactions. So we saw, for example, the communications being restored at the military level between the two nations, which were dismantled post Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan last year. So I think that element where the relationship was completely failing or completely coming apart, that restoring some of it back on tracks, perhaps from Biden's point of view, from US point of view, was the main achievement of this engagement. But let's also remember that Chinese are also not in a very particularly healthy space at this point. There is the economic crisis is soaring, and we are also hearing
Yes,
a new respiratory illness that is now
in China.
in China, and this is quite debilitating. In some ways, China is struggling on multiple fronts. While they proclaim global leadership, they also know that they have very few major friends available. When you have to list countries like North Korea and Pakistan as your main friends, you are in trouble. So I think certainly there is a crisis brewing vis-a-vis Chinese domestic politics, and there is a Chinese foreign policy. And for Xi Jinping, therefore, to come to the US being feted as a global leader, the chambers of commerce, the corporate sector in the US giving him a standing ovation is something that he would have liked to happen and to shore up his credibility. But fundamentally, nothing changed. I don't think either of the two nations are going to change their foreign policy trajectory based on their meetings, and I don't think any either of them have taken a stance that is different post the visit that was there before the visit. So I think broadly nothing much changes, but a degree of stability perhaps has been restored to the relationship, that the leaders have come together. They are looking at this relationship through a lens that perhaps creates greater predictability, and there is no communication gap or misperceptions that might lead to any further conflict. So that was the attempt, and if that was the intent, then perhaps something was achieved, but it was barely minimal. And at this point in time, when we are looking at the world politics and turmoil all around, I think even that minimalistic approach perhaps is very welcome.
Of course, the minimalistic approach also was like a step forward, and at least there was like you said, a working relationship needed to be established or re-established, considering the escalation in tension that the two countries saw in the last 1 year. Now, along with this, there has been also a 2+2 meeting between India and Australia and the United States, and India and Australia especially have been top-tier security partners. There's comprehensive strategic partnership between the countries. So how is this cooperation shaping up? The defense minister, as well as Penny Wong, the foreign minister, was here, especially when we look at this relationship in the context of the Indo-Pacific region. So how is this cooperation shaping up?
I think both the dialogue mechanisms that India has created, this 2+2 with the US and with Australia, they are very important in ensuring that regular high level communication continues between these nations that are very important partners in the Indo-Pacific, and a comprehensive assessment of how foreign policy and defense requirements have to be in sync with each other. That, I think, is essentially the message of such platforms. And India's engagement with Australia, of course, is deepening, is broadening, and those aspects are pretty evident whether you look at our people-to-people engagement, whether you look at our defense and foreign policy engagements, economic engagements. And I think in some ways, having these regular conversations allows policymakers to continue to keep the eye on the ball, that there's a larger strategic trajectory. There might be some challenges here and there, but because we have regular means of communication, they can be resolved. So I think that the India-Australia relationship today perhaps has become one of the strongest in the region. And as you look at India, Australia, not only dealing with each other bilaterally, dealing with each other trilaterally with other nations, and also quadrilaterally as part of the Quad, there's a new dynamic, there is a new dynamism in the relationship. And I think the recent 2+2 underscored and made that point, and also I think allowed for new possibilities to emerge. For example, on energy, on defense, on education. Those are the areas where I think India and Australia have benefited from, and they will continue to do so. In the context of, I think, India and the US, it was very interesting because to have two very senior US officials like Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense present in Delhi at a time when America is grappling with multiple challenges. I think it does two things. It generates confidence in India that India remains an important partner. That U.S. India relationship is at a level where, despite other aspects of foreign of international affairs taking center stage, this relationship continues to hold enough importance for Washington that this investment is being made. And I think it also allows for previous decisions to be reassessed. How far we have come and what needs to be what needs to be done now, that things have to be looked at through a new lens. For example, in G20 we announced India Middle East Europe Economic Corridor. Now, of course, it's because of the West Asian crisis, Middle Eastern challenges, it is at a standstill. But does that mean that we will lose steam, or is there enough space available between the two nations to continue to look at that project as an important possibility? And I think these 2+2 mechanisms, these regular consultations, allow for those kinds of possibilities to remain at the center stage of our engagement. And India-US engagement, of course, has a very interesting dynamic at the moment, that despite the challenges on multiple fronts, we have been able to keep an upward trajectory. And that's what was, once again, we saw this was stated as much in as many words by Blinken and Jaishankar both.
Absolutely. Despite the challenges on multiple fronts, the relationship has been on an upward trajectory. Now, something really interesting has also happened in the Netherlands, and I wanted your comment on that. How do you look at the victory of far-right leader, at extreme right, Geert Wilders? He was always looked at as someone who's or the right, the far right was like a fringe. But now we see that it's not just there, but in a lot of parts of Europe, the right is becoming more important, and it looks like almost a global phenomena. So the rise of far right and being very mainstream, how does that really impact the society? Also, with this very rising, refugee crisis all over, the refugees coming in these areas, and we've seen the reaction from these far right groups too. So something it creates more discontent.
Yes, I think it creates more discontent, and perhaps, Naghma, it is also a reflection of the discontent that people feel that the mainstream political parties have not really been able to effectively voice their concerns, because this is also a difficult time for Europeans. The cost of living crisis, the housing crisis, the economic crisis, this is taking a toll, and for mainstream parties not to address these issues opens this space to fringe elements. And that's what I think Mr. Wilders' victory reflects, that what we once considered to be on the margins of the discourse, he has taken over the discourse. This is his arguments on migration, on cost of living. They have been central to these debates. And of course, all the mainstream political parties were trying to address these questions this time. But perhaps they were too late. Had they engaged with this question earlier, and in a more effective manner, perhaps this would not have happened. But so I think his victory and the victory of other leaders, and we are seeing this trend now. We saw this in Hungary, we saw this in Slovakia. Now, we are seeing it in Netherlands, and of course, Marie Le Pen in France and AfD in Germany. All of them are doing well, better than in the past. And these groups, these parties, these organizations, these individuals, again, once were considered to be marginal in the regional discourse, today are at the center, because the issues that they've raised have not been effectively tackled, and many, I think, ordinary Europeans feel that their concerns are not being heard. So I think it demonstrates a real challenge for European policymakers as to how they go forward. And I think, of course, Mr. Wilders has talked of Nexit. along the along the lines of Brexit. I mean, there is enough support in Netherlands for European Union. It's unlikely to happen, and he knows that. But I think in some ways, the questions that he and his party are raising, and what has given them this victory, they will lead to some kind of a reassessment within Europe, that how do mainstream political parties remain relevant to contemporary challenges, and how do they address issues, as you mentioned, like refugees, like migration, like cost of living. What are the possibilities in areas where there can be a mainstream agreement on the challenges that they face? Because you can't really shun these questions aside, and you can't, because if you do that, you get these kind of results. So I do think that there is a churn in Europe, and that churn is being reflected in some of these very strange characters coming to the forefront and making their presence felt. But I think they are also reflective of a larger mood in Europe, which, if not tackled seriously, will can have grave consequences, not only for Europe but for the world at large, because Europe's interaction with the world, Europe's engagement with the world will be looked at through a very different prism if you have extreme characters, extreme politicians, extremist politicians taking center stage. And that, I think, is the challenge for Europe, and that is also in some ways, as you were pointing out in your question, a challenge for the world. That there's so much churn happening that I think the questions about how do you manage Europe, and how do you manage how do mainstream political parties manage governance challenges remains an open question. And I know we are ending, but I just wanted to add a bit on UK, which is very interesting, because Rishi Sunak, we saw how Braverman was marginalized, or was sacked, and Cameron has been brought back, which is one of the most interesting stories to come out of the UK, that you have a former prime minister now coming back as foreign minister and foreign secretary.
Yeah.
And I think that is going to be very interesting to watch out, because that again reflects that you have in Britain a governance challenge for the Tories, who of course at one point were talking, laid the foundations of Brexit, but now see, as a consequence of Brexit, find themselves in a very peculiar position where the economy is not doing well, and perhaps the Labour might come to power as a result of the decisions that they took. So it's an interesting story in Europe, where we are seeing the rise of the right in one case, Nexit, possibility of a Nexit in Netherlands, at least the rhetoric, but the costs of Brexit being felt by Britain, and how these two, I think these two very interesting equations pan out will also determine what happens in Europe.
Absolutely. That's a very interesting point. I mean, we see the failures actually in a way, or the challenges of Brexit, but at the same time, there is a possibility of Nexit. Will that be a possibility? That's a very interesting point to end this conversation on. And also the rise of the right, the challenge for the mainstream parties, the challenges that the mainstream parties have not really lived up to. Those are the questions that are coming up because of this churn that we see in Europe. Thank you so much for that analysis, Harsh. And that's all that we have time for on this episode of the Ideas Factory. Thank you for joining.